Our scripture reading is from 2 Samuel chapter 9. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still anyone of the house of Saul, that I may show kindness of God to him?" And Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." And the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, where did I go there? I lost myself. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I am your servant." And David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore you all the land of Saul your father. And you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant, that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both of his feet. This really is a great story for lots of reasons, and hopefully I can draw them out. It's an incredible picture, for one, of what Christ has done for us. And it's probably intended, maybe not by the author of 2 Samuel, but by the Spirit of God, who is inspiring the author of 2 Samuel. I think he intended us to see the connection between David and his son, the son of David, Jesus, and Mephibosheth, and all of us sitting in this room that have put our faith in Jesus Christ. Because there is a very strong parallel in our lives, and I will bring that out at the end. But I just wanted to begin by looking through this passage and see what an incredible thing we can just detect that's going on here. So the passage starts in 2 Samuel chapter 9, but we really need to go back a little bit. And if we go back a little bit to 2 Samuel chapter 7, we will see that the Lord says to David in this covenant ceremony, "But my steadfast love will not depart from him." That is a Hebrew word. It is said chesed. Kind of have to almost be pulling something up from your throat as you say it. Chesed. That is the word for covenant love or covenant loyalty. Sometimes it's translated as faithfulness. But a lot of times it's translated merely as kindness. But you got to go farther than kindness. It is a kindness that we give out of a loyalty that we have for someone. Not just a stranger on the street kind of kindness, that's a great kind of kindness as well, but a kindness that we give to people that we owe, in some sense, some kind of kindness to because of a promise that we have made. This is one of the reasons why in Ephesians chapter 4, one of the things that Paul reminds us that we must be doing towards one another in the church is to treat one another with kindness. Rosina, I'm sure, covered it right away in her marriage class. This is one of the reasons in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that when we're talking often, even in the context of a marriage relationship, one of the first things that seems to go in a marriage relationship is kindness. Kindness is a crucial part of a marriage relationship, or things are going to fall apart very quickly. But in the Bible, kindness is often connected to this word, which really means loyalty, loving commitment towards someone. And I read this verse here because I want to say something, a second thing, before I tell you why. As I mentioned last week, these stories are not in chronological order. And I am confident that this story is way out of chronological order, years and years out of chronological order. And one of the reasons why I can say that is, I think that this story takes place near the end of David's reign, or at least in the second half of David's reign. But it's been placed here, so we're going to have to ask the question, why did the author place this story so much farther in the early part of David's reign? Now, I'm going to give you two reasons why I'm confident it happened at the end of David's reign. The chapter begins with, and David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul?" And the answer is, there is. There's only one person left. His name is Mephibosheth. But we're going to learn in about 10 chapters, no, there's quite a few people left in the house of Saul. Micah's sister has 5 sons. There are 4 other sons of Saul or grandsons of Saul mentioned in that chapter. We'll get to it. It's a difficult chapter. The Gibeonites were a people that lived amongst the Israelites that Saul wrongfully tried to exterminate. When Israel had made a covenant with them all the way back in the days of Joshua not to harm them, Saul ignored that covenant and tried to extinguish the Gibeonite people in a particular city, and he took it for himself and his own family. And as a result of that, God brought a curse upon Israel in David's day. And David sought out through, I think, the prophet Nathan, why is God doing this? And the prophet says, it's because of what Saul did to the Gibeonites. Saul did not honor the covenant that Israel made with them. And now they're going to answer for it. And so consequently, David then asks, how can they make this right with the Gibeonites? And the Gibeonites, they asked for, I think, 7 of Saul's sons to be given to them. And we'll get to that story. But this tells me that chapter 9 and this story must come after that. Because at this point, only Mephibosheth is left. Well, that story is kind of near the end of David's reign. That's one reason. But there's a little clue in here that tells us another reason. Mephibosheth, when he comes to David, we're told right away that he has a young son, right? Named Micah. Well, let's get the Mephibosheth story in chronological order. When Saul died and Jonathan died on that mountain, very soon after that, David was named king in Hebron, okay? He ruled in Hebron for 6 years. Then he ruled over Israel. How long has David been ruling over Israel when this chapter happens? Well, he must have been ruling for quite some time, because we are told when Saul and Jonathan died, Mephibosheth was 5 years old. And he fled their house, and as he was fleeing their house with his nurse, Mephibosheth fell and injured both of his feet and became crippled. But he was a 5-year-old boy. That means Mephibosheth was a 5-year-old boy when David began his reign at Hebron. Well, do the math. Mephibosheth now has a small son. You got so many years have to pass, guys. At the very least, something like 15 or 16 years at a minimum would have to pass. That would put David at least 10 to 15 years into his reign, but more likely, probably longer than that. So I say that all to make one point. This story actually takes place quite a ways down the road. Why is it put here? Well, there might be two reasons. The fact that it was put quite a ways down the road raises this question. David, why are you just getting around to keeping your covenant with Jonathan? Why are you just getting around to keeping that? And then a second reason, why is it being put here? I think this one is easy. The writer put it here because he wants to connect David's faithfulness to the covenant that he made with Jonathan to the covenant faithfulness God has made with him. So in chapter 7, God lays out his covenant with David and says, I am going to show you chesed. I'm going to show you covenant love, David. And the appropriate response to receiving the covenant love of God is you better keep your promises just as he keeps his. David had already made a promise to show covenant love to Jonathan and his family. And I think the author puts this here because he wants us to see the connection between our promises and God's promises. Just as David should have seen it in his real life, but probably didn't. The writer wants us to see it. Because God has made promises to you, and he keeps those promises, you got to keep your promises. You got to keep your covenant promises. Guys, I know we are almost whitewashing this in today's world, but we cannot do it. There is a direct line between God's covenant promises to us and our covenant promises to our spouses. We have to keep them. We have to. Because when we don't keep those kinds of promises, we are raising the question to the world whether or not God will keep his promise, his exact same kind of promise, covenant promise, to us. And so this story, I think, is placed here because David is convicted. He is convicted because God has made him a promise, and God has been keeping that promise to him. And probably by this time in David's life, he's been keeping that promise to him, even though David has been making it pretty challenging for God to keep it. Like, for example, I'm going to suggest that this happens after the time of Uriah and Bathsheba. So maybe sometime after that, David realizes, God is keeping his promise to me, even though I had Uriah killed. To take his wife. God is still keeping his promise of love to me. I made a promise once, and I've never done anything about it. Can we find out if there's anybody remaining from Saul's family? Because I have a promise I need to keep. That's one of the reasons why I think it's here. There's a second reason why it's here, though, is it follows right on the chapter 8. And in chapter 8 is a story of how God has given David victory over all of his enemies. So at the end of chapter 8, you see David now has rest on every side. Well, this is interesting because when Jonathan made David make this promise, if you went back to 1 Samuel chapter 20, you would see words like this: David, when God gives you rest from all of your enemies, I want you to promise me something. I want you to promise that you will not wipe my family out, that you will spare my family, that you will allow us to continue. So I think that this chapter is put here in 2 Samuel because David has just gotten rest from all of his enemies. And as I pointed out last week, that's not even chronological. He didn't really get rest from all of his enemies until almost the end of his reign. But now it is time for David to remember the promise that he made to Jonathan. And maybe it is when all of a sudden he looked around and said, all of my enemies God has dealt with. Maybe that's what triggered in his mind. I need to do something about my promise that I made to Jonathan. So now we come, there's one other thing actually though at the end of this that I think is interesting, verse 15 of chapter 8. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. I think that chapter 9 is an example of how David treats all of his people with justice and equity, including the people that should be his enemies, the family of Saul, including the people that might be a threat to his kingdom, members of Saul's family. He treats them all with righteousness and justice and equity. And part of treating people right is keeping promises that you have made. And so now we come to chapter 9. And David said, is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? We might think that David only made a promise to Jonathan about sparing Jonathan's kids, but all the rest of them, they're up for grabs. That's actually not correct. He also made a promise to Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 24 that he would not exterminate Saul's children as well. And by the way, this you have to really be paying attention. In fact, David does not kill a single member of Saul's family, not one. The closest you can get to David killing somebody, it isn't David. It is, you could blame God for it. You could blame the Gibeonites. David hands 7 of Saul's grandsons, over to the Gibeonites because God has instructed him to do what the Gibeonites have asked. But that's not David putting them to death. They were put to death for the crime of wiping out that Gibeonite city. But that's not David putting them to death to protect his reign. And in fact, as we pointed out, David makes it very clear he has nothing to do with the death of, let's say, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, who took on the throne when David was reigning in Hebron. David obviously had nothing to do with the death of Saul and Jonathan. He was a long ways away when that happened. And the author of 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel is constantly reminding us David did not raise his hand against any member of Saul's family. Now there's only one member left, and he wants to find out if he can find him. And he wants to show him kindness. That's the word chesed. The exact same word that God has shown him, kindness. And he wants to show him kindness for Jonathan's sake, for the sake of another. Now, there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. Notice this guy's position. He is a servant in the house of Saul. Servants in a particular person's house typically do not own land. They work for somebody who owns land. They do not accumulate wealth. They are the wealth of somebody else's accumulation. So I want you to remember that, because when we come about here, it's like, wow, for a servant in the house of Saul, this man is really wealthy. Notice he has 20 servants now. 15 sons and 20 servants, and he has a great deal of land. And it raises the question how he got it. Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him?" This is a perfect person to ask this question, because it appears from the text pretty clearly that Ziba seems to be in control of all of Saul's wealth. So the question David might have is, since you seem to be the one taking care of and running and in control of all of Saul's land and all of his wealth, surely, isn't there someone left in his house that this actually belongs to? And to give Ziba some credit, he doesn't deny it. He says there is someone. And he responds, there is still a son of Jonathan. But notice what David actually says here. It's very crucial. And the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him? He doesn't say that I may show kindness to him. He says, I want to show the kindness of God to him. There's a great application here. I hope you can see it. But even when we become, I'll use David first. When David becomes God's king, everything David does is a reflection of God's actions. So one of the reasons why David needs to keep this promise, because if David doesn't keep this promise, God isn't keeping his promise. Not with David, but with Jonathan. Because David recognizes, as the king of Israel, every one of his actions reflect upon God and his actions. So consequently, this is not even about, I need to keep my promise. I need to show covenant kindness to Jonathan. This is about, because I am God's king, and I am his representative on earth, I must show Jonathan's son the kindness of God. If I don't show kindness to Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, then I am bringing a mark on God's character. So that's how David thought about his life. Everything he did, he thought, is an example of what God is doing. Well, you can see if you come to the New Testament, that same picture is made of us as followers of Jesus. Everything we do reflects on Jesus. So when we don't keep a promise, that's a reflection on Jesus. But we usually put it in the negative. We usually put it in the negative, like when I act in a way of selfishness, or when I covet something, or when I lie, I am a poor reflection on Jesus. That's fair. But this text, David's putting it in the positive. Maybe we should at least start in the positive. Guys, we are privileged to represent Jesus to this world. Every time we do something righteous, we are showing the world that it's Jesus doing something righteous through us. He gets the credit for that. David is not going to get any credit for keeping his covenant promise with Jonathan. God's going to get that credit. It's God's kindness that he wants to show, and that he does show ultimately. Notice what goes on next then. So where is he? And Ziba said to the king, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. Boy, there's so much that we can actually learn from just a geographical place. He's at the house of a man named Machir in a town called Lo-debar. Well, let's start with, where is Lo-debar? Interestingly, it is just outside of another place called Mahanaim. Now, you might remember this place was first mentioned in the story of Jacob. When Jacob was returning and Esau was coming out to meet him, Jacob made two camps. And he put certain people in one camp and other people in another camp, trying to protect his family and himself from Esau, because he was terrified of him. And he named it that name that I can't really say. Starts with an M, Mahanaim. And it means two camps. So that's where we first learn of this place. And then we hear of it again. It's the second time we hear of it in Scripture, when Ishbosheth sets up his kingdom. Ishbosheth set up his kingdom in this particular town. It is on the east side of the Jordan. It's about as far away from Hebron as you can get. It's not accidental. Ishbosheth set it as far away from where David was as he could possibly be. It's so far to the east that they're basically kissing the Ammonites, because the Ammonites have the kingdom right to the east of them. And so this is where Mephibosheth lives. Why does he live there? Well, it makes perfect sense that he would live there. When he fled with Ishbosheth, his uncle, and he moved to that place where they couldn't get any farther away from David than you could get. In fact, I'll come back to this. He lived right in the heart of the promised land, virtually maybe 5 miles, kind of like Bethlehem, about 5 miles from Jerusalem. And he moved east as far as he could move and still call himself in the promised land on the east side of the Jordan. And that's where he grew up. Lo-debar means no pasture. So the town that he lived in got its name No Pasture. You probably can picture it then. A town that gets named No Pasture means this is probably a pretty barren place. So Mephibosheth is living as far as he can away from David, to the east, in a place that is barren. That's where we're going to find him. And so we could say something about Machir, but maybe I should save that. Machir shows up again too, the man who is taking care of him. I will say it now because it's such a great illustration. Sorry, I can't go by it. It pays to be obedient. Guys, it pays to be obedient. God honors those people who honor him. When you keep your promise, God honors you because it makes his name look righteous, which it is. So David kept his promise, and he treated Mephibosheth in a particular way. Obviously, Mephibosheth was somebody who was very important to a man named Machir because Machir had taken it upon himself to take care of Mephibosheth. He didn't have to do that, but he did. So Machir, who also lives as far from David as you possibly can, a man who clearly had aligned himself with the house of Saul and against David, he sees David come and show mercy and grace to a person that he loves. Do you know when Machir shows up again? Absalom has dethroned David, and David has had to flee Jerusalem. And he takes off, and with a whole host of people, a large number of people, they fled to the east side of the Jordan to get as far away from Absalom as they could get. And lo and behold, they end up at Lo-debar. And Machir and a couple of Ammonites actually come and bring food for the whole host of people that are with David. Now, why would he do that? Why would Machir, a person who's clearly aligned with the Saulites, bring incredible amounts of food to feed David and the host of people with him? Well, the only thing we have in the Bible that could give us a clue is because of David's mercy and grace that he extended to Mephibosheth. Now, you don't extend mercy and grace to get something back. Wrong mentality. But at the same time, when you do it for the right reasons, God has a way of paying you back. God has a way of blessing you when you're doing what he wants you to do for the right reasons. And he will do it in the most opportune time, as David will discover down the road. So then we come back to chapter 9. And Mephibosheth comes to David. And it says here, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he answered, Behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, Do not fear. Just subtle differences in the way the author writes this. When Ziba comes to David and they have a conversation, if you look at this, and the king said, and the king said, and the king said, David's name is not mentioned one time in the conversation with Ziba. When Mephibosheth comes to the king is not mentioned one time in that conversation. David said, David said, David said. Now, this is the author doing this. But clearly, the author is trying to make a point here that the way David talked to Ziba He talked to him as if he was his king. But the way David talked to Mephibosheth, he talked to him as if he was his brother. Always with his personal name. And David said, and it says here, the first thing David says to him, do not fear. I think David recognized that when Mephibosheth came and fell at his feet and paid homage to him, that Mephibosheth was terrified. And he had good reason to be terrified, because in every culture, including Israelite culture, unfortunately, when the tribes split into two kingdoms, this happened every single time in the north. Whenever you had a change of kingship, a change of dynasties, the prior dynasty, every single member of that dynasty is killed. That happened everywhere. In Egypt, Syria, Persia, every kingdom around Israel. If you have a change of dynasty, every member of the prior dynasty would be put to death by the next dynasty. And unfortunately, even in Israel, that happened again and again and again. It didn't happen in Judah, but remember, the reason why it didn't happen in Judah? Because the dynasty never changed. It was always the same family. But if you read 1st and 2nd Kings, you will see that in the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes, every time the family changed of who was going to sit on that throne, all of the members of the prior family, they were executed. So there is a reason why Mephibosheth is terrified. When he gets called, David has called you to his presence. The whole way, I'm confident that Mephibosheth is thinking, I'm dead meat. I am dead meat. There is no hope for me. So he is thinking one thing. Can you imagine being Mephibosheth? That whole trip down, it's like you are walking to the gallows, because no one would ever spare you in this situation. And he gets there, and he falls on his face, maybe to plead mercy, and the first thing David says, don't be afraid. Do not be afraid, because you are not here for why you think you're here. And he says then to him, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all of the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? That last line tells us that Mephibosheth is completely caught off guard. He has no idea that this is coming, and he can't even comprehend it. I want you to see several things here before we move on from it. The first thing I want you to see is, how did Ziba end up with Saul's land? Well, it's actually fairly simple. When Saul and Jonathan died, the Philistines moved in, and they ran roughshod over Israel for several years. I suspect that all of Saul's property was taken by the Philistines. I want you to see this, because I want you to see that David has every right to do with what he's going to do here. Then David was made king of the north, and one of the first things that he did is he outed all of those Philistines from the land of Israel. He drove them from the land, which did what? It meant that the Philistines that were in control of lots of different lands in Israel, but especially Saul's, they were driven off that land and back down into Gath and Akron and the cities of the Philistines. So in Saul's case, in his land, once the Philistines were driven out, what happened to it? Ziba moved in. He moved in because he was a servant of Saul, and he probably continued to work that land, but now that land, he thought, belonged to him. And he became wealthy off that land and had 20 servants. The whole time, Ziba knows there is actually a child of Jonathan that has a right to that land. Now, guys, this isn't even like our inheritance laws. This is Israelite inheritance laws. You do not lose property in Israel. The promised land was set up in such a way that even if you had to lose that property in 50 years, in the year of Jubilee, it had to be given back to your family. That land was Saul's, and his descendants, and it cannot be taken from him. It cannot be. And yet it appears that Ziba has done that. And he's done it because King David made it available to him by driving out the Philistines. So when David says, I'm going to give that land to Mephibosheth, he not only has every right to do that because he's the one that liberated that land, he has every obligation to do it because that land belongs to the family of Saul as a part of his promised land inheritance. It cannot be taken from them. And Ziba knows this. This will come in a little bit later. So he tells him, I'm going to give you this land, and Ziba's going to return to be the servant that he is supposed to be, and he is going to take care of all of your needs. You're not going to have to worry about anything. But then comes the greatest line in the passage. And you shall eat at my table always. You shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as this? Mephibosheth is not overwhelmed by the fact that David gave him his inheritance back. Mephibosheth is overwhelmed that David has invited him to sit at his table for all time. If you don't believe that, you are going to see it spelled out clearly in a few chapters. Mephibosheth does not care about the land. He does not care about Ziba being his servant. He does not care about wealth. He cares about one thing: sitting at that table. Why is that so important to him? Because that statement, you will sit at my table always, is something that belongs to a son of the king. Basically, David is saying to Mephibosheth, you're not here to be put to death. You're here to be adopted. I'm adopting you as one of my children, and you will sit at my table. There's such an unbelievable picture of what's going on here. First of all, let's go back to the original promise. When Jonathan asked David to make a promise, this is what he asked David to promise. Promise that you won't kill my son. He didn't ask David, promise me that you'll make my son your son. He said, just spare him. Let my family continue. That's what David promised. When David came to fulfill his promise, what did he do? Well, he did that. He let him continue, but he restored all of his wealth, and he made him a part of his family. So let me get this right. David is the kind of man that when he extends chesed, covenant love kindness, to someone that he's made a promise to, he does far beyond what he has even promised. Who does that sound like? Is that where Paul gets it in Ephesians? God has made us promises. We are the heir of certain promises with Jesus. And then what does Paul say in Ephesians? And when those promises are fulfilled, it will be beyond what you can even comprehend. Because when God fulfills his promises, he does not keep the letter of the law. He goes way beyond. Boy, could you imagine how that would transform our marriages? We've made promises in our marriages. We don't even keep the letter of the law of those promises. So often we don't even keep the letter of the law. But if we wanted to reflect the character of God to our spouse, to our children, to the communities that we are a part of, to this world, we would have to keep that promise in such a way that it goes way beyond anything we ever said at our weddings. It has to go way beyond that. We have a heck of a time keeping that promise in sickness. We can't even get past that one. And I think that's the first vow. In sickness, forget the health part. I'm sure it's different in every relationship. But let me tell you, it's tough in our relationship with either Mary or I are sick. It's a tense situation in that relationship. Sickness creates problems. That's the very first vow that we make, in sickness and in health. This particular passage tells me Guys, we got to go way beyond what we even promised if we want to reflect who God is. That's what David does here. And then he says, "You're going to eat at my table." Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul, and that you've taken over, and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson, because that's where it belongs. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him and shall bring in the produce that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. You all will be his servants." Now, we don't get it from this passage, but I don't think Ziba liked that. And then he says, "But don't worry about too much taking care of Mephibosheth, because he's going to eat at my table. I'll take care of him. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Let me conclude with this. I hope you see the picture, because the points of contact are everywhere. Mephibosheth is a 5-year-old boy. He was born into a cursed family. You do know that, right? Before he was ever born, he was already cursed, because God had already put a curse on Saul and said, "Saul, because of your sin, because of your unfaithfulness, because of your rebellion, I have rejected your house." Saul's whole house was rejected by God. Even Jonathan was rejected, at least as king, right? I don't think he was rejected in terms of a relationship with God, but he was rejected as God's next king because of a curse that fell on Saul. Don't miss it, guys. Jonathan is the crown prince. He would have been the one who would have reigned after Saul. And Mephibosheth is his only son. Mephibosheth is a crown prince as well. He's the one that's supposed to be on the throne. But because of a curse that was placed on his grandfather before he ever was born and did anything right or wrong, Mephibosheth was born into that curse. Does that sound familiar? Everyone in this room was born into the curse of Adam because of something he did. He rebelled against God, and we are his children, and we are a part of that curse. And then we learn about Mephibosheth, that when Saul died and they were fleeing from the Philistines, this boy is running out of the house and he falls. And he becomes crippled. So he's doubly cursed, because lameness or crippledness in Israel was seen as a curse. And so here this kid he grows up with a double curse complex. First, I was cursed by being born in the family of Saul. Now I'm cursed by God a second time because he allowed me to become crippled. And I can't even go before him and in his presence because I'm crippled. This boy, Mephibosheth, could only think of himself as doubly cursed by God. And then what do we see? Even when he leaves his home, his palatial home, where he lived the first 5 years of his life, he goes east. Guys, when Adam was driven from the garden, he was driven east of the garden. In fact, most people think the Garden of Eden would have been somewhere in the Promised Land. And that when Adam sinned, he went east to the east of the Promised Land. And then when Cain sinned, he went farther east. And then when Noah came off the ark, he went farther east. And in fact, you get to Abraham, he's as far east as they knew you could get by the time we're introduced to Abraham. And then God calls him home. And for the rest of Abraham's life, he's been going west for the rest of his life. But you see this movement in Genesis of eastward away from the presence of God. And you get the exact same thing here. Mephibosheth is moving east. And not only is he moving east, he's moving away from David, God's king. And by moving away from David, you know what else he's moving away from? The tabernacle and the presence of God, which is now in Jerusalem. And he is getting as far away from the tabernacle as he can get and still be an Israelite. That's us, guys. Until we come to Christ, our whole life moves in the direction away from him. And sometimes we try to get as far away from God as we possibly can get. Now, I'm not going to avoid my theology here because it's so well pictured. Is there any place in this story where Mephibosheth says, I think I'll seek out David? I heard he made a promise to my dad. Maybe he'd keep it. Mephibosheth does nothing but hide from David and keep his head down. So how in the world does he end up at the king's table? Because the king went searching for him. David seeks out Mephibosheth. Isn't there someone whom I could extend my love to? Let's go find him. Where is he at? No distance too far, David is going to go and find him. And Jesus is going to go and find you. Jesus says to his disciples, you didn't seek me, I sought you. Not one of you sought me. I went and I found you, and I brought you to me. And that is exactly what is pictured in this story. And so Mephibosheth is brought into this relationship and this beautiful picture, and you are going to sit at my table, and you're going to share in my life, and I am going to sustain your life. Now, I want to conclude this sermon with some verses from another chapter. I think it's chapter 19, maybe. I can't tell the whole story, but Ziba lies about Mephibosheth, gets him into trouble, and David takes all of this away from Mephibosheth when he is away, but when he comes back to Jerusalem, the author of 2 Samuel tells us this about Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king when he was returning after Absalom had died. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. In other words, he was in mourning. When Mephibosheth was separated from his king David, it was like he had died. And he was in mourning. He didn't do any of these things. And when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? And he answered, my lord, O king, my servant deceived me. Ziba deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for you, that you may ride it and go with the king. For your servant is lame. He has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. Isn't that a great answer for a disciple of Jesus? Even when we're in trouble, even when we're wrongly being accused, even when unjust things are happening to us in our life, do we have the courage to say to Jesus, but whatever you think, Lord, I will accept it. You do to me whatever you deem right. That's what Mephibosheth is saying. He's being unjustly treated, and he's not asking David to, he just wants David to believe him that he did not do this. But I will accept anything that you do. For all my father's house were but men doomed to death. All of humanity is doomed to death. What further right have I than to cry to the king? And the king said to him, why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziba shall divide the land. And Mephibosheth said to the king, oh, let him take it all. Let him take it all, since my lord, the king, has come home safely. You want to know when you've arrived as a disciple of Jesus? When he is the only thing that matters to you. When the things of this world, you can have them. Your earthly inheritance, don't need it. Give it to somebody else. Just let me sit at this table with you. Mephibosheth is a picture of us, but he's also a picture of what we need to become. That is a disciple. That is a person who is returning loving kindness to the one who showed it to him. Let him have it. Give it to Ziba. I don't care. My king is home, and I just want to sit at your table. What a great picture for us as we follow Jesus. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this passage and the wonderful story it presents. And I hope that as we meditate upon it, we can be drawn to this person, Mephibosheth, and that our lives can parallel his, that we can have the gratitude that he has, the appreciation that he has, that we can see the salvation that he experienced, we can see it like he sees it. And that it can transform our hearts like it transformed his. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's stand, sing this song, and then join us in the fellowship hall.
Welcome to our broadcast. We're glad you could join us this morning. If you'd like to get a copy of the bulletin for today's service, just go to ChristFellowshipChurchDL.org, and you can view a copy online. If you'd like to join us some Sunday morning,